What about migration in this whole issue? I mean, if we have different cultures coming together, completely opposed cultures sometimes, like we see in Europe with the Islamic world coming into Europe, and we know all the studies that show that social capital decreases the more diverse the society is. Robert Putnam and others have shown this. How can you have a nation state when you have an extremely diverse social reality, so to speak, and with groups that don't even mingle with each other, that don't interact with each other? Are we generating or creating the basis for a crisis of the nation state in the future? Are we see at some point the Balkanization of Europe? I'm exaggerating maybe, I don't know. But how do you see this, threat? Because I believe it's a threat. And of course, when you say this, again, people tell you that you are a xenophobe and all this, but I don't care. And this interview will be watched by thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people in the Spanish-speaking world. So I think they are really anxious to listen to your opinion on this.
Well, first, I need to make it clear that I'm an immigrant.
My family is.
And I immigrated to the United States. I'm married to a Somali-born asylum seeker who became a Dutch citizen and is now a US citizen, having immigrated again to the United States. And so it would be bizarre if I were to say, we have a fundamental problem with immigration. That would be wrong. Immigration has been a source of creativity, of dynamism. It has made countries like the United States and Chile what they are. And we should be very careful not to say things that seem to imply that immigration itself is a problem. The problem is not immigration. The problem is non-assimilation. The problem is the failure to integrate newcomers into the host society. Now, this did not used to be an issue in the United States, because in the United States, it was very clear that the minute you got off the boat at Ellis Island, you were embarking on a process of Americanization. I recently wrote The Life of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger arrived in New York City as a refugee from Germany in 1938. And if only there had been more refugees like his family, there would have been fewer victims of the Holocaust. The minute the Kissingers arrived in New York City, he was learning English as well as working, attending baseball games, learning the rules of baseball. Kissinger is one of the few people who knows as much about baseball as he does about football, which is very remarkable, and assimilating. That was what made the American experiment so successful. Every time people would say, there's a problem with the Irish, with the East European Jews, there's a problem with the South Italians, this will never work, it would turn out to be wrong. Because one generation later, that group would have second and third generation people in Congress. So I was always skeptical of Sam Huntington's argument that the Mexicans were somehow not going to be assimilated, because I didn't see any obvious difference between where the Mexicans were when Huntington published, when was it, 10 years ago, and where the Irish and South Italians and the Jews were 100 years ago. And I think the same processes are still capable of working if Americans remain committed to the notion of assimilation. The minute the United States goes down the route of multiculturalism and says, no, you don't need to read or learn to read English, we'll make the documents available in your language of choice. You don't need actually even to attend public schools, you can have your own schools. The minute the United States goes down that route, it's on a fast track to being Europe. And Europe is really the place that I think we need to worry about.
And then there are differences, because my point mostly is about the Islamic world. Because if you take a look at, in Germany, for instance, at integration Asians, people coming from China, Vietnam, and all these countries, and Latin Americans even, or Eastern Europeans, they don't show many problems when it comes to integration and assimilation. But when it comes to people coming from the Muslim world, you have huge, massive problems all over Europe, at least in Germany, France, and countries like this. So it seems to be a difference. Like Thomas Sowell argues, there is no such thing as an abstract migrant. You have different people coming from different cultures, and they have different results when they come into your country. So now we know integration and assimilation in Europe is failing and has failed. Is it fair to argue that would it be wise to control this sort of migration and to have criteria or some kind of rules in order to accept migrants that would really benefit your society and that you know they will integrate? Because in Europe it has not worked, even though they have invested billions in trying to integrate people coming from these countries.
Well, I think there are a few points to make here. One is that labour markets, especially in Northern Europe, have done badly with almost all foreign-born workers. The unemployment rate for foreign-born workers, regardless of where they came from, is significantly higher than the unemployment rate for native-born workers all over Northern Europe. In fact, it gets worse the further north you go. And this is a legacy, I think, of what happened in the 1990s when much smaller populations came to Germany and Scandinavia and elsewhere from countries like Somalia. So I think we already had quite good evidence that at the very basic level of giving people jobs, Northern Europe didn't do well. Secondly, these countries do not have a great tradition of assimilation in the way that the United States does, and so they were much readier to buy the multiculturalist line, that they should allow people to continue using their own languages, to have their own schools, to have their own neighborhoods. And I think that was a major policy error that was made, and it was made some time ago, and it's really hard to correct once you've established those norms. Immigrant communities are self-reinforcing. People tend to migrate to where there are already people from their native land. And so it's hard to correct that. The third point is that there has been a counter-assimilation institution at work in the case of Muslim immigrants. And that institution is called the mosque. All over Europe, in mosques, in Islamic centers, Muslim schools, there is a sustained effort to keep Muslims from assimilating, to resist integration. And this is systematic. It is what my wife Ayaan Hirsi Ali has written about as dawah, non-violent extremism. And that is a major reason why the problem is specific to Muslim communities. They're the ones who are being told, do not become like the infidel. Do not let your children associate with the infidel. These are the communities where people are threatened if there's so much as seen walking down the street with a non-Muslim member of the opposite sex. I think that's a really big part of the problem. And by and large, European governments have been very slow to realize the extent to which networks of non-violent extremism have penetrated through mosques and Islamic centers, their Muslim communities. Everybody's terribly surprised when people run off to Syria to join Islamic State, as happened a lot in recent years. They wonder why this happened. But when you look at the biographies of the people who did that, they had been exposed all their lives to a refrain of do not assimilate. This is unfortunately contrary to your basic teachings as a Muslim. And Ayaan has written, I think, very thoughtfully about the cognitive dissonance you experience as a second or third generation Muslim in Germany. This is true in Turkish communities, where actually the sense of conflict between what you're being taught in the mosque and what you experience in your everyday life creates a great tension that can in some ways be resolved by saying, okay, I reject completely the secular world and I'm going to embrace Islam in its most fundamentalist version.